In this video, I'm going to show you how you can take a pile of cut up wiring harness like this and make it work again for your project car.
This is so bad. I honestly can't believe how many places this is cut in.
Real quick, before we dive into the car, I just want to show you a couple of things that I think you could use to make this job a lot easier on yourself. First of all, you're going to want a wiring diagram for the car, something that gives you a lot of information on how wires run, what the harness is supposed to look like. Highly recommend that. You're gonna need a few supplies. You're gonna need wire, you're gonna need butt connectors, you're gonna need solder, you're gonna need heat shrink, you're gonna need whatever your preferred form of attachment is for connecting the wires again. I'm a big butt connector guy. If you use a good crimper that makes a U, not just a crimper that smashes them together, I've had really good luck with butt connectors. You're gonna need wire, not copper coated aluminum. Use real copper wire, oxygen free copper, copper welding wire, stuff like that. You want stranded, not solid core, because solid core will eventually crack and break on you. You want stranded wire. I like some magnets and some zip ties to secure things. A lot more modern, makes things easier to put together and take apart. You're gonna want some generic cutters, picks for prying connectors apart, cutter for cutting insulation, stuff like that. Soldering iron and solder is good. And of course, you're gonna need a heat shrink gun. I also recommend some electrical tape, and you'll probably end up wanting a few other tools to help take apart or put back together. Real quick, I'd like to take the opportunity to show you what this car that we're working on is. This is my 1966 Ford Thunderbird project. This car is a spaceship and a half. It's huge. It's got every option under the sun. This is truly a space race era car. There was so much technology for the time put into this car. It has every feature you can imagine in the interior: AC, heat, all kinds of lights, everything you can think of, power seats. This thing even has power steering actuated windshield wipers, which doesn't make any sense to me, but I guess that was the 60s. I'm super excited to get this thing back on the road, so let's tear into this wiring harness. Moving inside the car, you can see the extent of damage here is honestly incredible. The previous owner just completely hacked this thing up to get it out. And the reason I don't want to put a universal harness in this car is because it is a spaceship. It has just so many connectors, so many features, and I'd like to be able to say that it pretty much all works when I get done with it. So unfortunately, something that's going to make this a little harder is he also cut it right next to connectors in several places. So that doesn't leave me a lot of wire to work with, so that's going to be kind of exciting. I may have to source some replacement connectors in a couple spots, but I'm going to try to make it all work. First thing I want you to do if you have a harness that's cut up this badly is just look at it. You can use common sense to learn a lot about how this should be. You can see that this cut matches up very nicely with this cut. This bundle of wires went here, and this bundle of wires went there, and you can even see the split in the tape or loom lines up right there. I have this piece, which is just cut out right in the middle, that goes here. This other bundle that's cut out right in the middle that attached to these wires here. These three wires, the way that this fairly clearly goes up and runs across the dash somehow, these three wires must have gone to this connector. So that's going to be fun to reconnect. I want to show you how I would reconnect these with butt connectors and tear into it. Mostly figured out how it goes. I'm going to begin by connecting this large bundle back to itself right here. Start. I'm going to take my box cutter and I'm going to remove some of the tape or loom on both sides of it. And don't do what I just did and cut a wire. I'm going to remove enough room that I can fairly easily work on this giant bundle of wires. And I'm going to come back over here and do the same thing. Pick one. I'm going to go for this orange wire first. And I'm going to strip it and connect it. So to strip it, I'm going to take my strippers. I'm going to make an educated guess that this is probably, it's not 10 gauge, it might be 12 or 14 gauge, but I suspect it's something like 16 gauge. I'm going to identify how deep I need to have stripped. It's not very deep. Take my strippers, line it up all the way around it with the cutter on the strippers, and there you have a wire. You're going to take your connector, put it over it. You can try to put a little twist on the wire on these smaller wires. I don't think it's really necessary. All right, make sure it looks like it pretty much goes in halfway, and it does. Line it up. Make sure everything's pushed together good. Crimp on it. For a smaller wire like this, you might need a smaller crimper. And when you pull on it, it should not pull off. And this does not. I'm gonna go to the other side. We're gonna do the same thing from two directions. Put it together and crimp it. And I am going to repeat these steps for every other connection here. I'm gonna be here all day as a result. All right, this bundle is starting to get bulky. I'm gonna take my heat gun. Gets hot very quickly, will burn you. When you're done with your heat gun, don't set it or the wires down right away on anything plastic that it can melt. Make sure to set it down on metal or so that the end of the heat gun's not touching anything at all. Let that cool for just a second and connect the rest of the wire. Right now, I know at this point there's at least a few of you going, oh my gosh, how can you use butt connectors for that many wires? You should be soldering every connection. Well, to be honest, I think soldering every connection would be a lot more difficult, and I don't think it would be more secure. Wires flex, right? And when you have solder, it tends to make a very brittle joint. As the car bounces down the road, solder can actually crack. Now, there's a couple reasons I'm not soldering. One, it can crack. Two, I'm not very good at it. Three, I would spend a lot longer trying to solder every one of these connections back together. All of this crap times 5 or 6 different places than I will just using butt connectors. 4, butt connectors make a very high quality connection, right? The key is to use decent quality butt connectors and to use a set of crimpers that crimps plenty small enough for the wire size that you're working with. Man, that was a lot of work. You can definitely see that this adds some thickness to the bundle, but they are all connected, crimped well. I feel good about the way that it's turned out. When you find yourself with a connector such as this, where there is basically no wire to work with, we technically could crimp a butt connector on here, but my issue with that is that's going to leave us without very much flexible wire right next to this connector. So I am going to elect to do this joint as a solder joint instead. My method is going to be to take a piece of wire and push it right into the wire that I'm going to solder it with to try to intermix them as well as I can. And with them intermixed, I'm going to take my soldering iron, which is hot. I'm going to put a little blob of solder on there. And this blob of solder is going to be used to help heat transfer into the joint. We need to have the joint nice and hot. Otherwise, you end up with what's called a cold solder joint. Cold solder joint will not adhere well. So we get the joint starting to warm up. And this is honestly a pain. I hate soldering, but this is definitely probably the best way to do a joint such as this. Okay, and you can see the joint's hot because all the solder in the joint is melting. I'm going to put a generous amount of solder into the joint now that I finally got it hot. All right, and that is a solid joint that I expect will stay together. I'm going to repeat that for the other 2 wires on this connector. So I have my heat shrink on here. Remember to put your heat shrink on first if you're soldering directly to a harness or something. And there you have it. But what about the wiring diagrams? I told you we were probably going to need to look at wiring diagrams for this car for almost any project that has an extensive amount of damage, and that's true. So I want to give you an example of why, and something that I'm going to have to figure out how to make the engine crank from inside the car using the wiring harness. The ignition switch is still in the dash, and I'm not going to pull it out of the dash today, but I wanted to determine what wires and where I can find that inside the car. This is the plug for the ignition switch. It's got yellow, red and blue, red and brown, and green and red. 4 wires. And the importance of having a wiring diagram is we can actually learn what those do, right? This is the same connector here. Starting with yellow 21, that comes into this. We can trace 21, goes to 37, 37, picks up power at the starter relay directly from the battery. Right, so we know yellow is main power into the switch. Green, red is 904. So that's this green and red. Green with the small red stripe, 904. Goes to the alternator regulator. So that's the alternator exciter wire, or tells the regulator that the alternator should start making power. What else do we have? We have 16. 16 is red with a green stripe. Thinking what I was calling brown must be a really faded green. 16 goes to, so that is supposed to be green. It's not green anymore. 16 goes to this disconnect and goes to the other side of the starter relay. 32, red with the blue stripe. 32 goes through the neutral starter switch, starter neutral switch, and to the starter relay to activate it. So that does all make sense. So that was kind of a lot of sleuthing, but the outcome of it is I was able to determine that this bulkhead has all the wires that eventually end up at the ignition switch. And that's important because I want to be able to test if I have the starting functions of the car working when I get done with this harness today. It looks like I could probably do that now, as long as the fuses in it are all in place and good. So I was getting ready to crank the thing over from inside the car, and look what I found. The positive doesn't connect here anywhere like it's supposed to, so that's kind of weird. So I started looking around and I found these 3 wires that probably are all supposed to go to the negative terminal. Here's my big yellow wire I was expecting to find. So I'm going to do just a little more looking and make sure that it's safe, and then I'm going to connect these to the positive terminal for now, so I can try to make this thing crank from inside of the car. All right, so everything's back together, and I think I got it all hooked up correctly. The wire colors actually don't match the diagram, so now I'm going to try it. All right, so remember the ignition switch hooks up right here. Power comes from this wire into the ignition switch, and when you go to crank it, it should put power on this wire. And it does. Man, today has just been win after win after win on this car. I got so much done on the wiring harness, probably about 80% fixed. I'm able to crank the car from inside the car. That's a major step towards putting the car back together, back into one piece. Hopefully you guys will never see a wiring harness that's been cut up and hacked up this much. There's some spot where there's some damage, where clearly the rats that infested this car did some damage to the car, to the wiring harness, but a lot of these spots were just spots where the previous owner honestly cut up the wiring harness trying to get the dash, trying to get the interior out a lot easier. I'm sure it did make it a lot easier, but I don't believe it was worth it in the long run, honestly. In the next video, I'm going to try to get the wiring harness finished up. I'm going to try to get the AC heater core box back in the car. Obviously, it won't have AC and heat yet. We're a long ways from this thing running, but I'm going to try to get that stuff back in the car. And I'm going to try to start from here on out, moving towards getting the car together one step at a time. If you enjoyed this video, give me a like and subscribe. Tell me what I should do with this car. Tell me if you know any tips, tricks, anything that you can tell me, because I'm always open to learning. I know a lot of you know a lot more than I do about certain things. So thanks for watching. See you in the next video.